Hi, you guys. It's Professor Daniel, and I'm back. So, this chapter we'll be talking about chapter three. So, this lesson is over chapter three. And the title in your Give Me Liberty textbook by Eric Foner is Creating Anglo-America. So, the scope of this chapter is actually quite large. This chapter will go from about 1660 to about 1750. So we'll be covering almost 100 years of material in this chapter, but don't get overwhelmed. I try to break it down in a way that is not very overwhelming, and we're going to try to stay within specific themes. So in this chapter, we're really going to be talking about how these colonies are making money, right? It's very important. The role of the colonies is to gain, I would say, material, gain wealth for the mother country. These colonies are not independent. They are, I like to kind of consider them as satellite nations. So while you have the colony of Virginia and the colony of Maryland and the colonies in New England, the purpose of these colonies is to make money, is to produce wealth for the mother country, which is England. So in this chapter starts with talking about mercantile theory or mercantilism. So let's define that really quickly. Mercantilism is an economic policy, and this economic policy essentially says that wealth is power, and the key to gaining this wealth is to export more goods, more than you import. So you want to sell more than you buy, right? So European countries would compete at this time for world power, and they needed the colonies to provide necessary raw materials. So the colonies, their goal, their purpose is to provide these raw materials so the mother country doesn't have to import that raw material, whatever it is, from another European nation, thus increasing that nation's power. And so we'll really be focusing on that. We'll be focusing on what raw materials certain colonies end up producing for the mother country. And some of these things we've already covered. So, in chapter two, we talked a lot about the Chesapeake colonies and a bit about the New England colonies. And the raw material that was very popular in the Chesapeake is tobacco. So, I'm sorry, these Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland, they're not independent. They are part of the English Empire. So, they are able to get this tobacco and they're able to send it to England. So now England doesn't have to import tobacco from the Dutch or from the French. So it increases their wealth and their power. And that is the goal. That's the goal of a lot of these colonies at this time. So we're going to move forward. So in your lecture, I think it's about like the second or third slide, I have a slide titled Mercantilism Illustrated, and it is perfect. So please, if you have it, pause me and pull this up because it will really help you to understand what mercantile theory is. So I'll describe it for those of you who don't have it pulled up or can't pull it up for whatever reason. So in this picture, you see a queen type of figure, and there are three maids, and the maids are wearing aprons, and they say colony at the bottom, and each maid is holding a platter. The first maid has a platter that says gold and silver. The second maid has a platter that says foodstuffs, and the third maid has a platter that just says raw materials. And they're bringing this platter to a queen, and the queen is wearing the sash that says mother country. So this is an illustration of mercantilism. It's the role of the colonies to bring raw materials such as tobacco and rice and lumber or any foodstuffs or gold and silver. It's their purpose, it's their job to send those things or to export them to the mother country. In order for the mother country to make any type of money with this type of theory, trade has to be controlled, i.e., the colonies can't even trade with each other in this type of mercantile system. raw materials from the colonies will end up greatly increasing British power. And they do this through a series of acts called the Navigation Acts. So, Navigation Acts, there have been navigation acts that go all the way back to the 1300s, but those are not the ones that we're talking about. We will specifically be talking about three navigation acts that all take place in the 17th century. So, there's one navigation act that takes place in 1651, which is followed by another one in 1660, and then another one in 1663. Now, what was the purpose of these navigation acts? The purpose or the goal of the navigation acts was to try to gain control of world trade. Okay, so remember that even though we're focusing on the English because that's who we're colonized by, the English are not the only European power that are present in North America at this time. The Dutch have a pretty large presence because the Dutch have built a trading, dare I say, empire. They do a lot of trading as far like the fur trade, for example. The Dutch are pretty much monopolized and capitalized on the fur trade. So they have a good thing going. So these navigation acts will essentially give more and more control to the English. So these acts will reduce trade, I'm sorry, not reduce, but restrict, I'm sorry, trade and commerce with other nations. So starting in 1651, uh, foreign owned ships could not, okay, foreign owned ships could not export or import goods to and from England. So England, being a growing world power at this time, is saying, well, if you want to trade with us, you have to be us. Then in 1660 they go a little further and say that on these ships 75% of the ship's crew must be English. And then in 1663 they go even further and say that all cargo that is bound for America must be inspected in England and they have to be taxed before leaving England. So you're probably wondering, like, why would they do this? Why would they have all of these rules? It's important to know again that America is occupied by European rivals, and none of these rivals want to share. They're all competing for world power. So the navigation acts will really greatly impact North American trade. It will drive the Dutch, for example, from English colonial trade because the colonies, because of the navigation acts, will not be able to perform any trade with the Dutch. So slowly, these navigation acts begin to take a little bit of control from the Dutch Empire, which, or I would say from the Dutch, which has a pretty decent empire in North America at this time. So if you remember, the Dutch are located in what we know now as New York, but it is called New Amsterdam or New Netherlands at this time. Okay, so moving forward, a little background. New Netherlands, starting, I would say, really before the Navigation Acts, and then it becomes, I would say, concrete with the Navigation Acts. It goes, I would say, it ends up being conquered by the English. It's no bloodshed. I wouldn't say it's not a battle, it is more of a surrender of New Netherlands. So when Charles II assumes the throne in England, he promises New Netherlands to his brother James. His brother James, at this time, his position is the Duke of York. Aha, so see that name, the Duke of York. So the Dutch, or I'm sorry, the English go to New Netherlands, forcing a Dutch surrender of New Netherlands. And it goes under English control around 1644. And it's renamed New York after Charles II's brother, James, who is the Duke of York. The terms of this surrender say that the English, for one, they will respect the English and the property status of the colony's diverse communities. Because remember, New Netherlands has different rules. For one, women, once they get married, are able to maintain their own separate legal identity, meaning that As a person, you maintain your legal status and you're able to go to court on behalf of yourself as an individual, as a person, without having to have your husband speak for you. That's something that they had in New Netherlands. They also had freedom of the press, for example, in New Netherlands as well. But I digress. Once the English um, take over New Netherlands, some of those things will change. So, for example, they will end that Dutch law that allowed married women to conduct business in their own name. So, it will end this Dutch law that allowed women to have, or I would say married women, to maintain a separate legal identity. Also, when the English come, they will introduce more restrictive attitudes towards Blacks. In this class, you will notice that when I refer to Black people, I will not refer to them as African Americans until after the Civil War, because we had to have a constitutional amendment. Um, to be considered American, to be considered citizens. So you will notice that I won't say Black Americans, I will just say Blacks. Also, I will say enslaved Blacks. Just a side note, it's important for a lot of historians are realizing now, instead, we'll be talking about slavery in this chapter. I will not refer to these people as slaves per se, as much as I will try to refer to them as enslaved persons. I've noticed that through my years of teaching, a lot of students will, without realizing it, when they're talking about a Black person, they will use the word slave kind of interchangeably with Black. So when we get to the emancipation of enslaved persons, they will say free slaves, which is quite oxymoronic, right? So I'm doing my best to really make sure that you guys know that these are not slaves, they are enslaved persons, right? So let's keep that humanity in there. But going back to the lesson, once the English take over New Netherlands, they will introduce more restrictive attitudes towards Blacks, including expelling Blacks from skilled jobs. That's one thing that we will notice, not only in this era in history, but as we continue to the 18th and 19th and even 20th centuries. African Americans, even once we get to being African Americans and Blacks in this country, will often be barred from skilled employment. So that's one thing that we'll realize. And as we go through the semester, you'll see other examples. But this is an example that's showing back in the 1600s, once the English take over New Netherlands, one of the things that they do is to expel free Blacks from these skilled jobs. Okay? So, your book also talks about the founding of the Carolinas, and I found this really interesting. So, the purpose of Carolina is to be a barrier to the Spanish, because remember, the English are not the only European power on the North American continent. The Spanish are here as well. And right now, the Spanish are in Florida. And so the purpose of Carolina is to serve as a barrier of sorts for the Spanish. However, it's really difficult to get people to settle in Carolina. It's not the most hospitable environment because, again, remember, once people are going, it can be difficult to get settlers to these areas because they're not settling in communities. They have to build the community. They are the community, and it's very dangerous. And so it's very difficult to get people to settle in the Carolinas. And so, in order to attract more settlers, they will introduce the head right system, which is something that we talked about last chapter as well. But to give you a refresher, the head right system is a system that says if you pay for someone's way, if you pay your own way or the way of other people, will give you land. And so if you're able to pay your way, you automatically get a pretty healthy tract of land. Um, so they want to give, that is the way that they try to attract settlers because remember, land is important. Land is so important during this time. Not only does it give men and women control of their own labor, it gives them a source of wealth. You have the decision of whether you want to sell that land or if you want to lease or rent that land out. It gives you options. And in many colonies, land or having land ownership under your belt also gives you the right to engage in political suffrage and political life. It gives you the right to vote. So land is really important. And so, in order to get people to uh, come or to settle in this area, they will institute the head right system and give people land. And so, a lot of these early settlers, most of them will come from Barbados and from like the West Indies. Others will come from like Virginia and such. And they will kind of instantly constitute plantation slavery. The thing about Carolina is that it grows very slowly until the planters discover rice. So, for one, if you know anything about rice and where rice grows, it grows in areas that I would say are pretty marshy. It needs water. Um, and in order for these people to grow rice and to be around water, that also means that you're going to be around mosquitoes. And a disease that mosquitoes carry, for example, is malaria. Once we get to talking about South Carolina and the South Carolina Sea Islands and such and the Gullah culture, this will make a lot more sense. It will grow, but, anyways, Carolina will grow pretty slowly until they discover rice. A lot of people will die from malaria. They don't have any type of immunity to malaria. However, as Americans import more and more West African slaves, one thing that they will discover is that some West Africans have a partial immunity to malaria because they have been in areas where they have experienced malaria, right? And so that will accelerate, in some part, will help to accelerate the slave trade. Also, you get so much land. And so the more slaves, if you bring slaves, you automatically have a plantation. And so it makes Carolina a highly hierarchical society because if you bring someone, you have this land, if you have slaves, you automatically have a plantation. You're automatically in this uh, planter class. Right. So slave owners will have a big advantage, I will say, in Carolina or in the Carolinas. Another colony that your book talks about is Pennsylvania. And your book refers to Pennsylvania as the Holy Experiment because it is founded by William Penn, who is a Quaker. Quakers are also known as the Society of Friends. So, on a quiz or a test, if you hear me talk about the Society of Friends, please know that I'm referring to Quakers. Don't get mixed up with that. William Penn was a Quaker, and he wanted a place where those who are facing religious persecution in Europe or could come and enjoy a sense of spiritual freedom. And so he creates this place called Pennsylvania for this, or to be like I would say a haven for those who are facing religious persecution. Pennsylvania is ahead of its time in some ways. So, for one, I would say it's ahead of its time because it's governed according to Quaker principles. So, Quakers believe in equality before God. They believe that liberty is something that should be universal. William Penn will also arrange to purchase some of this land from the Lenni Lenape. He will actually purchase the land before settling the land, which is something that's also, I would say, quite different. In Pennsylvania, the land is pretty inexpensive. The climate is healthy, so you don't have people who are perishing from disease in Pennsylvania. Um, so I said it's governed according to Quaker principles. And so one question that I always have every semester is, does this mean that Quakers never owned slaves? Quakers did at some point own slaves, but Quakers will also emancipate their slaves. They will come to realize that slavery is incongruent to the principles that they spout, these Quaker principles. And so they will eventually emancipate their slaves. In Pennsylvania, the assembly is elected by male taxpayers and freemen, and which made the majority of men actually eligible to vote in Pennsylvania. So it's something that is incredibly interesting. Also in Pennsylvania, they would offer refuge to tribes that have been driven out of the area by other colonies and by warfare. So Pennsylvania is a bit of a refuge in early colonial America. So, in this part of the chapter, your book will transition to, I'll say, it will make a transition to talking about the origins of American slavery. So, the utilization of African slaves for labor was not initially planned, but it's so financially prosperous that they make that transition. We remember in the last chapter, I talked about how, especially with tobacco, once Virginia finds the substitute for gold, which is tobacco, early on, a lot of the labor is met by young, male, white indentured servants. However, remember, indentured servants serve for 5 to 7 years, or usually it's 5 to 7 years. That's the typical, I would say, term of indenture. And then after that, in some colonies, indentured servants are able to get freedom dues. However, it becomes pretty clear, I would say early on, to transition to using African enslaved persons who will never be free. So you don't always have to find another group of workers to fulfill your labor needs. Also, by the 16th century, anti-black stereotypes, even in England, have already been pretty pervasive. So it wouldn't have been too far-fetched for them to jump to using African slaves or African enslaved persons for labor. It's really tobacco cultivation, as I said before, that will accelerate Chesapeake planters to turn to I'm sorry, to African slaves, because they'll never be free. And so you don't have to give them any land, you don't have to give them anything. So, last chapter, we went over some differences between indentured servants and enslaved persons and the rights that each have. So, for one, indentured servants are protected under English common law. They don't lose their humanity when they become an indentured servant. Another thing is that their terms of service would eventually expire. So, if you were a woman and you got pregnant, you could see your length of servitude or your term of servitude lengthened to cover that time that you were pregnant, maybe not able to perform those duties. However, even if it's lengthened, you would eventually get your freedom. Another thing is that the status of indentured servant, it's not something that's attached to your person. It's not something that is attached to your bloodline, which means the status is not inherited. So if a woman is an indentured servant, sure, her term can be lengthened. Her term of servitude can be lengthened, but her child is not going to be an indentured servant because its mother was an indentured servant. However, for enslaved persons, laws begin to change pretty rapidly to, I would say, solidify the social status of enslaved people in a way that will make Africans enslavable, I will say, in a way that Europeans are not enslavable. Enslaved people could not claim protections under English common law. Pretty early on in the colonies, they will even create laws that say that enslaved people are not people, that they are to be treated as property, and property cannot claim protections under the law. Um, Enslaved persons, their terms of service never expired. It's something that was in perpetuity or forever. You served forever. And one of the most important things to remember is that the status of slave is inherited. So if a woman is enslaved and she gives birth to a child, that child is automatically born with that status of slave because it is inherited from mother to child. Okay, that is a status that is inherited from mother to child. So, like I said before, it's not far fetched for these Englishmen to begin to use African slaves because they already view alien peoples with a sense of disdain. Race, yes, is a social construct. It's this idea that humanity is divided into these well defined groups that are associated with skin color. And by the time we are in England, by the time we get to 17th century England, which is the 1600s, anti-black stereotypes are already pretty pervasive in that society, and they view Africans as being so different, and these differences make them enslavable in a way that Europeans are not enslavable. And one thing that I also teach my classes is that enslaved people are almost always outsiders. They are usually transported from elsewhere to their place of labor. And I always ask my students, why are slaves almost always outsiders? And I want you guys to think of that. What is the benefit of having an enslaved person being an outsider versus someone who is local? So think about that for a few moments. Pause me if you have to. And think about that for a few moments. Why are enslaved persons almost always outsiders? Always give the example for my students, since I'm Houston based. I give the example um, of, let's say, you are kidnapping someone, right? And you're bringing them to Houston. You probably wouldn't want to kidnap a Houstonian and bring them to Houston because they're going to know how to get home. They're going to be familiar with the landscape. However, if you kidnap someone and you bring them to another place, it's harder for you to escape because you don't speak the language. You don't know who you can trust. You don't know the landscape. So it's very difficult to escape when you don't know the landscape. You don't know where safety is because no place is safe. So enslaved people are almost always outsiders because you're easier to control when you're not in your comfort area, when you're not in an area that you're familiar with, especially if you don't speak the language. There's no one that you can reach out to for help. So that's something that I want you guys to really think about as you complete the work in this chapter. Another thing that people love to play devil's advocate, and they'll say, well, slavery has existed for all of human history, so blah. Yes, slavery has existed for all of human history, but what makes slavery different in America is that it's based on the plantation, and it's based on race. A lot of societies have enslaved people. Even African societies enslaved people, but it didn't have to do with race. They would enslave maybe prisoners of war or if you had a debt. Right? But it wasn't based on race. It wasn't based on the plantation. Slavery in America, this plantation based racial caste system, will draw a permanent line between whites and blacks. The shipping of blacks from Africa to the New World in North and South America will become a major international business. Um, the Indian population, the Native American population, by the time we get to this point, a lot of them have been wiped out by disease. And white indentured servants are unwilling to do the backbreaking work of sugar cultivation, which remember is the first major import. And so they will import, or Europeans will import African slaves to do this sort of work. And over time, slavery becomes associated with race. Enslaved people are always black historically. So, sugar is the first crop to be mass marketed to consumers in Europe. So one of the first plantation economies will be sugar economies. So I think either in the first or second chapter we talked about Sao Tome, which is right off the coast uh, of West Africa, and it was the first sugar plantation to be worked by enslaved Africans. Sugar is very important. Sugar is a major export. Um, Slavery will develop slowly in North America, but it will be present in other areas. It's not just North America. We often have this misconception, especially in America, that this is the only place that slavery existed, but it's not. The largest number, I would say the largest population of enslaved, or I would say of African people outside of the African continent is not in America, but it's actually in Brazil because of slavery, because they exported so many more African peoples to Brazil. And why do you think they would do that? Why do we have such a large population of Africans in Brazil instead of, America, like a lot of people would assume? Even if you look at the map, and of course, account for distortions in the map, from West Africa, the distance is a lot shorter to Brazil than it is to North America. It's a much longer distance between North America here than it is to Brazil in South America. And because of this, Brazil will get a large amount of African slaves. They will treat these enslaved Africans very, very poorly because they will be so easy to replace. But I digress. In the Chesapeake, going back to North America, in the Chesapeake, the most important social distinction in the 17th century was between the white plantation owners who dominated politics and society and everyone else. Because remember, in the Chesapeake, in order to be able to vote, you had to own land. So those who owned land, and in the Chesapeake, a lot of people came as indentured servants, as opposed to New England where you have families. But in the Chesapeake, a lot of people will come as indentured servants. And so the big social distinction in the 17th century in the Chesapeake will be between those who own property and thus dominate politics because they own this property and everyone else. Now, as I stated a couple of lectures ago, and as you guys did some work on the 1619 project with this past module, you guys actually read a piece from the 1619 project. The first 20 Africans will arrive in Virginia in 1619. So before there was plantation based slavery, blacks and whites would labor together. They would even establish intimate relationships with one another. They would run away with one another. However, as racial distinctions begin to be built into the law, things in society will change. So by the 1620s, blacks have already been barred from military service in colonial America. And in 1643, there was a poll tax enacted on African women. These laws will continue. In 1662, in Virginia, there will be a law that states that the status of offspring between enslaved people and free people, the status of that child follows that of the mother. That's why I use that example of an enslaved mother giving birth, because by 1662 in Virginia, this law said that the status, right, of this um, I guess you could say, of this procreative relationship is, the status of this offspring, of this child, has to follow that of the mother. How will this impact slave owners? If you are a planter, if you are a wealthy planter who owns slaves, that means that anytime you rape or engage in any sort of sexual um, exploitation with your enslaved property, you are gaining another piece of property. So it says that even these slave owners, if they have sex with these slave women, if they rape these enslaved women, the status follows that of the mother. If there is a pregnancy that comes with it, the status follows the mom. In 1667, the Virginia House of Burgesses said that even if an enslaved person converted to Christianity, that did not release them from bondage. Prior to that, if you converted, it's like, okay, you're a good Christian. Okay, you can have some freedom. But by 1667, that was no longer an option. Furthermore, any offspring of interracial relationships were viewed as being illegitimate. White women were often punished for having children with black men. That was another thing. White women are often punished for having children with black men. Um, Another thing, especially in the Chesapeake, that really shows how ingrained slavery was in the system. You could not even free an enslaved person unless you took them out of the colony. The law slowly began to treat anyone with African ancestry as Black, and the social status of that person would change depending on what they're viewed as. Your ancestry really viewed, or really, I would say, determined your status in American society. Your book also goes over Bacon's Rebellion. I will quickly go over Bacon's Rebellion. This takes place in 1676. A lot of these governors in early Chesapeake society have alliances with wealthy planters. I mean, they themselves, a lot of the times, are wealthy planters because in the Chesapeake, in order to be able to vote, you have to own land. And in order to hold political office, you have to own a certain amount of land. The right to vote is confined to white male landowners, and this becomes I would say, a huge source of contention. A lot of these settlers who are being led by Nathaniel Bacon, um, really at this point, they begin to demand, they want land. They need this land. They want it because land is so important. It gives you the right to vote. It gives you a source of your labor. It gives you a source of wealth. And so they want land so desperately that they begin to demand that the Governor William Berkeley, either exterminate or remove Native Americans to make more room for white settlers. And Berkeley refuses because he fears that if he does this, that there will be warfare within the colony. Now, the thing with Nathaniel Bacon, which I find really interesting, is that he is actually a pretty wealthy planter himself. He arrives in Virginia in 1673. And he arrives with this idea where he does want removal of Native Americans from the colony. And he ends up gaining a lot of support. He gains support from small farmers and from poor whites who want land. And they view the removal of Native Americans as the solution to their land problem. He will even get the support of indentured servants because, of course, after they're done with their terms of servitude, they want land. And surprisingly enough, he'll even get some support from some Africans. This will demonstrate, oddly, that whites and blacks could be united for a cause because Bacon's followers want this land. They will lead Indian massacres and end up massacring a number of Native Americans. And it ends up, I would say, evolving into a full fledged rebellion against the governor and his cronies. So Bacon is promising freedom and land to those who support him, and they end up going and burning Jamestown, Virginia, and Berkeley, in fear, flees Jamestown. So I would say that Bacon has a brief victory in Jamestown. However, warships from England will arrive to put down, or I would say suppress, this rebellion. And Bacon Bacon is not hanged because he ends up dying before he can, he ends up dying in jail before he can face any type of legal consequence, but 23 of his supporters are hanged. The consequences of this rebellion are pretty numerous. So, for one, authorities will reduce some taxes and they will adopt a more aggressive Indian policy. Freedom dues will also be redefined to include 50 acres of land. So you won't have this issue of poor whites and indentured servants getting together with slaves to demand, or enslaved people to demand land. Because also, Virginia authorities will, especially after Bacon's Rebellion, will really, I would say, like, turn up the speed with accelerating the shift to slaves who would never become free on tobacco plantations. So they solve this issue in that way. So between 1680 and 1700, slave labor begins to replace indentured servitude, especially in the Chesapeake, and there are lower death rates. By 1705, there is a slave code in Virginia that states that slaves are property and can be bought, sold, leased. They can be fought over in court. They can be inherited. So if one person owns enslaved persons, they can write in their will that they want this enslaved person to go to this person and this other enslaved person to go to another family member. They can be inherited. Enslaved people and free blacks at this point even cannot own arms. They can't own guns. So that reduces the power of even free blacks who are around at this time. They cannot employ any white servants. So this, not only does this put in stone a status for enslaved people, it also puts in this status for Black people, saying that you are on a lower rung of society than your white counterparts. So, you, as a Black person, even if you were free, even if you can afford it, you cannot employ a white person because the social hierarchy states or dictates that, as with your level in society, a white person cannot serve you because that would be beneath them, right? It also forbids enslaved people and free Black people for striking a white person for any reason. So I have a quote from the Virginia Slave Code that says, quote, all servants imported and brought into the country who were not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resist his master, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened. End quote. So, what this code says is that enslaved people are considered property. And even if in punishing said slave, you accidentally kill them, you can't be punished. The master will be, quote, free of all punishment, as if accident never happened. It's almost like saying you cannot be brought to court for breaking a chair. I'm sitting on a chair. I'm sitting in a chair, a very comfortable chair right now. If I were to get angry and in a fit of rage, I pick up this chair and I swing it and break it against the wall, no one's going to bring me to court for breaking my own chair because it's property. And what is astounding is this is how law, specifically Virginia law, viewed enslaved people, not as people, but as property to be owned, to be bought, sold, fought over in court, inherited, and passed down in wills. Your text also refers to the Glorious Revolution. Now, in this lecture, I will not go over all of the nitty gritty of the Glorious Revolution. I always like to include the Glorious Revolution, however, because it's quite significant, because it shows that even though it doesn't take place in the colonies, it demonstrates that whatever happens abroad in England is going to impact the colonies because they are England. And remember, people who live in the colonies at this time, they don't view themselves as Americans, okay? They view themselves as Englishmen. Even as we get to the 1700s, and even as we get to the point where these people are declaring independence, they first do not want to declare independence. They are seeking the rights due to them as Englishmen. They view themselves as Englishmen. But I digress. So the Glorious Revolution takes place in 1688, and I will give a very light sprinkling of the Glorious Revolution. So um, the Glorious Revolution will replace James II, who was Catholic, with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband. Ah ha ha, the Dutch are back. And her Dutch husband, William of Orange. So England, there is a lot of religious tension. And whenever a leader comes to the throne, the religion of the country changes depending on the religion of that leader, which will cause a lot of chaos. It's very chaotic. So James II is Catholic. So under him, England is Catholic. And then again, now it's Protestant. So James II, when he enters or when he is the king, he will decree toleration for Catholics because he's Catholic. However, by in England at this time, there is a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. There's this fear of potpourri. Potpery, ERY, not potpourri, not the smell good stuff, but potpourri associated with the Pope. Potpourri is this widely held belief that Catholics wanted to, I would say, overthrow the government, or I would say it's more of an idea that they really dislike the idea of the Pope being the head of the church, right? The Dutch, William of Orange, will assume the throne by force. Please read this in your book because, again, the reason I am going over this is because I want just to illustrate how this change is going to trigger rebellions in the colonies. So, last class or last lecture, we talked about Maryland. Maryland was a proprietary colony. Um, all of the appointed or the, I would say, appointed officials are Catholic, but the majority of people in the colony are actually Protestant. So it will trigger a lot of rebellions in that sense, right? And so, um, just think of that. All right, let's skip through here. In your book, I want you guys to read about the Salem witch trials and the persecution of witches. Um, in doing this, it's not that these women, please don't think that any of these women were witches. Anyone who was accused of being a witch was usually always a woman, and it was punishable by execution. Between 1400 and 1800, about 50,000 people are executed in Europe after being accused of being witches. But again, in the 1600s and prior, there's this huge belief in the supernatural that evil forces could impact people and impact their daily lives. One of the witch trials that you guys have heard of, that I know almost everyone has heard of, is the Salem witch trials. But it is not the only area. It's not just Salem that has witch trials and issues with women being accused of witches. So look into some of these other witch trials. I think there was one in Connecticut as well. But in Salem in late 1691, some young girls end up suffering fits and nightmares, and many people believe them to be bewitched or like possessed by, a witchy spirit. The only way these witch trials go on the way that they do, because really the only way to spare your own life was to confess of being bewitched and to name someone else to avoid being punished. So it's like, I'm not a witch. It's the fact, it's not me. This other person has put this evil thought in my head. So it's not me, it's them. Right. So this is how this spreads and continues, because in an effort to really cover themselves and protect themselves, people end up naming all of these other people to read about the 17 or read about the witch trials. I also said all of that to tell you guys that 18th century British America is not a melting pot of cultures. It's not a melting pot of religion. It's not a religiously diverse or religiously free place in the least. Of course, outside of New England, it's more diverse, because in New England, remember, you had to be a member of the church in certain areas to even be able to be a member of the colony. There is a level of de facto toleration among Protestant denominations, and that is because as the years go by, you'll get more and more and more Protestant denominations, more types of churches, and so people will just become more tolerant because there is more visibility. But again, America is not a melting pot. If you were Jewish and you are facing religious restrictions in Europe and you want to come to America, it's not a free place. Jewish people in 18th century British America are barred from voting. So it's not this melting pot of cultures. It's not this free place where everyone is living in this beautiful harmony. It's actually quite the opposite. There is a lot of Native American life that is in transition. By the 18th century, by the 1700s in America, Indian communities and cultures are very different by this time than they were at the time of first contact. Native American, the population has the population has been devastated by warfare, by disease. Um, and a lot of this is because simply they're seen as an obstruction to the colonists' desire for land. Okay, so by the 18th century, by the 1700s, Native American society has already been devastated, really, by um, colonial presence, by this European colonial presence. Um, by the time we also get to the 1700s, Great Britain by this time has eclipsed the Dutch as the leading producer and trader of consumer goods. Most people who are in North America at this time live in the countryside. The cities are not vastly populated. It's really home to artisans, really. So most people live in the countryside. A lot of people don't live in the cities in early America. However, you do get the development of a colonial elite. And that happens, I would say, relatively easily. And I only say that with these large air quotes. I say relatively easily because if you're in a society where only those who have money, i.e., land, are able to vote, you're going to get the establishment of this elite because there's this clear delineation between haves and have nots. And so you get this colonial elite. Because there is more and more trade, you get an upper class of merchants as well. Remember, a lot of colonies have instituted the headright system. And so if you have slaves and you buy, you have land automatically, there are no banks in colonial America. So planters end up accumulating a lot of wealth with trade in tobacco. And you start to see the establishment of these family dynasties, of these families who will have large amounts of land. One member or the matriarch or patriarch will die, they will pass that land down. And so when I say you have the establishment of family dynasties, I say that because now by this time you have people who are wealthy and they're able to pass that wealth down to generations. We also have you'll have the colonial elite who experience something that your book will call Anglicization. So, Anglicization is this process where elites, I would say, are differentiating themselves from the regular folk. And so they will develop a common lifestyle and a sense of common interests. And they will become more and more English, not more and more American. There is no American at this point. And so Anglicization is this process by which they will become more and more English. Because remember, America doesn't have an aristocracy. And so when they're looking for this landed aristocracy, they're going to look to England for those people. The richest people at this time are your South Carolina planters. There is wealth in the colonies. As there is wealth, there is also poverty. So, enslaved people will live in incredibly impoverished conditions. In the cities, those who do not have property or propertyless wage earners, as your book calls them, people who don't own anything, but they're working day to day, that will increase. A lot of people will view the poor as being lazy and responsible for their own fate and their own plight in society. Um, as the death rate declines in the colonies as well, family life will become a bit more stabilized and marriages will begin to become more lifelong commitments as the death rate declines there. The role of women is to be wives and mothers, and there will then be a definition of what we will call women's work. So, I will go ahead and end the lecture here. I appear to be frozen, but hopefully I'm not. But I will be back with any questions that you guys have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture on chapter 3. I'll be back next week with chapter 4. I'll see you guys later. And again, if you have any questions, write them to me and I'll answer those questions right here in the lecture. All right. See you guys later. Deuces.